Great, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Lang. As you can see, I am a project manager at the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, one of the 12 regional development corporations for the state. And we service the Windham region, so southeastern Vermont. And today we're on a Knowledge Bites webinar, which is something that the program I run puts on. The Southern Vermont Economy Project serves actually both Windham and Bennington, and it is a capacity building program. So we put on these short webinars during lunchtime to just bring resources and experts to our region to just connect more people in our region to that kind of stuff. So today I am joined by Jonathan Cooper. Jonathan, if you just want to unmute and introduce yourself, and we'll get started.
All right, good morning, everybody. Jonathan Cooper, and I work on community and economic development with the Bennington County Regional Commission. And we function both as the Regional Planning Commission and Regional Development Corporation for our service area in southwestern Vermont. And so as Sarah has described, today's session is about the 2022 project submission phase of the Southern Vermont Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. A document whose somewhat dry title does deliver what it promises, a comprehensive economic development strategy. Now, it's sort of in the broad parlance, kind of a regional plan, but with respect to economic and community development. And in this instance, we're looking at a two-county area, both service areas of our organizations. And this is a federally approved document. We went through a process in 2017 and 2018 to produce what you see there, which lives online. You can see one link to it. It also is on the BCRC website. But we're looking at some of the nuts and bolts of what makes an economy hum and how we can improve that. So we're talking about economies. We're talking about the population of the economy. We're talking about the geography between us. We're talking about workforce development issues, transportation and access issues, so environmental issues, and then some sort of resource issues. And as we look at our next slide, we'll talk about sort of 5 important objectives that came out of that process that we really wanted to. There were 2 overarching goals: to strengthen business and to support people. But we didn't want to just sort of limit it to a wish list. We sort of needed to talk about, well, how do we want to strengthen business and support people? What are the targets that we want to hit? How would we hit them? A CEDS has a sort of 5-year timeline or shelf life, you might say, but it's really not meant to live on a shelf. And the project submission process that we put together is one of the best ways we have of ensuring that document remains relevant to our two counties, to our region, and engaged with, and that entities in those regions are engaged with that document. So here are the first 2 of the 5 objectives. The first was to increase our population. Some of these seem, in light of the pandemic, a little prescient, but almost every region everywhere that's losing people needs more people. And that's actually a very tried and true basic of economic development. So we want to bring more people into Southern Vermont. Prior to the pandemic, each county was tracking to lose about 4 to 5% of its population, which is problematic to say the least. The next 3 objectives kind of existed to talk about all the ways we might consider broadly the term infrastructure. The first was to expand our business infrastructure so that we could encourage more jobs and investment and opportunities in Southern Vermont, both for entities that are outside of the region that might want to relocate and for entities that were within the region and would wish to grow. If we could jump to the next slide, Sarah. We'll get to the other 3 objectives. First was to improve our physical infrastructure. We need to have critical infrastructural improvements on hand so that we're both new resident ready and business ready. And that's something that, in light of some of the subsequent things we'll be talking about, say ARPA, municipal funding, we see that, we've been talking about an issue that has been on people's minds for a long time. And perhaps this is an interesting opportunity to make some real headway there. I want to enhance our social infrastructure. I think some of you have seen in the news that sometimes select boards or planning commissions can have a hard time finding people to be a part of it. We know that Southern Vermont's towns, like many across the state, are really special places to live for reasons that are not necessarily easy to put down on a piece of paper. But there is a quality of life that draws people. We want to maintain that as best we can at the appropriate scales for the many municipalities that are within the Southern Vermont area. And finally, we wanted to strengthen our economic development capacity. One of the first things that I learned in my profession was that you have to celebrate the things that you want more of And then you have to know how to get more. So as we talk through the rest of the day today, you'll see some opportunities or some examples of how we've been able to strengthen that capacity so that both the professionals and other partners and residents in the region are able to recognize and see how what they're doing and what we're all doing contributes to the growth and the sustained excellence of our regional economy. Then our next slide, Sarah, if we could jump to that, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So these are just some fast facts if you're maybe new to the CEDS project submission process. As Jonathan said, we created the joint CEDS document for Southern Vermont in 2019. So this is actually year 4. It is a 5-year document. So I guess we should put on our calendar renewing coming up, in the next couple of years. So that process involved basically the 2 sort of citizen groups, if you will. The Regional Economic Development Group that was in Bennington, and then the Southeastern Vermont Economic Development Strategies Group, which was in Windham County. These projects are, once they're submitted, they are reviewed and ranked by a committee of people in our community. So we have people who represent municipalities, we have people who represent nonprofit or for-profit businesses. And I think the important thing to note is just that it's not our organization, our organizations that are doing those ranking and looking at the projects to choose the vital projects. There's always a vital projects list that is announced every year with the project submissions, and that will be announced in spring of 2022. We'll get in a little bit later about why the timeline has changed. Typically, we ask for submissions January to March. Now we're asking for submissions October and November. So Jonathan will talk a little bit why we changed that. But these projects that are submitted will be considered part of the 2022 list. And since 2019, we've had 224 projects submitted. So I think that's a pretty big number considering our small communities, and we love to see that number grow.
So this is an interesting year with respect to project activity. And I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about just some of the things that are that could be driving that in one way, shape, or form. There's a lot of, an unprecedented number of both dollars and interest in those dollars and sort of activity going on in this project-based response to the pandemic. For the first time in was it 40 years or so, direct federal funding go into municipalities for a largely not quite unrestricted use, but for over $22 million in our region. And that's a big number for many of our municipalities. The Paycheck Protection Program, for example, over $200 million for businesses in Windham and Bennington County. Economic recovery grants, the ACCD, hit our service areas with about another $40.5 million. And that's just 3 programs. I think there's been Department of Children and Families, Forest Parks and Rec. I mean, all sorts of elements of our state government have been channeling resources to organizations, municipalities, to nonprofits, to businesses, both to support and sort of prevent the effects and the shocks of the pandemic from getting worse, but then also to help, to borrow a phrase, build back better. But so what you're seeing there is just, and then we had a very interesting element to it as well with the census taking place in 2020. And so we now know that the landscape really is different than it was in 2018. We have had a sort of cross the Rubicon moment. But as we were looking at things and preparing for this presentation today, we thought, this year there are more people, but there's more activity. There are more projects out there, which means there are more stories to tell. There are more initiatives to support. There's more coverage from our active press in our region. And so this is something we felt like we saw, I wouldn't call it a perfect storm, but a number of factors that we thought might contribute to a really strong project submission year, as we have more participants and more players who are more active in this economy than perhaps in years past. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit, sort of shading as to why we're shifting the project timeline. So as Sarah said, I'll get into that in more detail in a moment. But for this slide, we just want to take a minute to think about all that's gone into this region in terms of support and funding, and what sort of transformative activities are taking place right now in our towns, in our villages, in our businesses. And that's something that we want to capitalize on with the project submission process. Sarah, maybe jump to the next slide then. So as Sarah mentioned, one of the things that one of the centerpieces of this process is the vital project sort of announcement. This gives us a chance we want to amplify all the projects that were submitted, but sort of shine a special light on a handful that the project review committee, which we'll describe in a little bit more detail later on, sees as really offering the strongest promise, or ones that we feel like we need to amplify the most. And you can see there a list. We have a geographic spread. We see a bricks and mortar addition to the rec center in Bennington for Head Start and Early Head Start, addressing a critical need in childcare. We see Food Connects working on new markets and infrastructure, supporting a broader sort of farms and food producers across Vermont. An initiative of the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporations for Community Facilities Technical Assistance. That's a USDA grant program. And if we think back to that objective, that fifth objective of enhancing our economic development capacity, to my knowledge, the BDCC was the one regional development corporation to have a regionally focused person with deep expertise in the community facilities program of the USDA. I don't know if anybody got to attend the Dorset Theater Festival's outdoor season at the Southern Vermont Arts Center. It was my wife and I, our first date in 2 years, and it was spectacular. It was a really remarkable show and a remarkable initiative that was meant to bring people together in a safe, pandemic, conscientious manner. And it was wonderful to be sitting outside at nighttime, watching a play and listening to the laughter of other people. It was something that I think was almost medicinal for many of us. You can see DV Fiber, and then a little farther down, the Southern Vermont Communications Union District, two sort of regional, I guess at this point, they are political subdivisions of the state of Vermont, but I think maybe some of you heard that over in the last couple of days, an announcement from the Vermont Community Broadband Board that DV Fiber will receive $4.1 million to assist in their broadband fiber build out. So we're seeing some vital projects that have real consequence, both in the moment and for the long term. You'll see other sort of initiatives of entities as small as Perrin Recreations, which runs activities at Lake Perrin in North Bennington. You'll see some more well-established organizations or large organizations like Retreat Farm, and then some municipal activities in Whitingham, like their sewer infrastructure ongoing projects. So the vital projects, as you can see, collect initiatives from a broad swath of the community. We have businesses, we have nonprofits, we have municipalities, and the goal is to amplify what's going on with our vital projects, as well as what's going on throughout the region. And it can provide a good jumping off point for some of the public relations campaigns, and also for some of the additional grant sourcing campaigns that some of these initiatives may undertake. Sarah, can we move to the next slide then?
Great. So Jonathan talked a little bit about this already, which is great. So perfect transition. One of the biggest questions we get during this process is, what's the point? To put it bluntly. And, Jonathan was just touching on it. I think one thing I really want to make clear is that there is no funding tied to this project submission. I think that's often what people assume. And we try and be pretty clear in our communication about it. I mean, it sort of mirrors in a way like a grant application process. So I can definitely understand why people would think that there's funding. However, there is no funding. But there are some pretty big non-financial, non-monetary benefits of being included and submitting a CEDS project. So one, Jonathan touched on, is really about indicating to federal, state, private donors that your project is aligned with the regionals planned. You'll see, I think, definitely in some USDA and probably some state-related grants, there is a checkbox that asks, does your project align with the regional economies plan? And that often gets an application of a few more extra points in that scale of grading those grant applications. And so by submitting your project, you are indicating to these agencies that do have a lot of money to give that the project that you are working on, that you're applying to their funding for, it is aligned. You know, it's not some project that's kind of like way out in left field and really has no relation to what's going on in your community or your region. You are saying your project's goals are aligned with your community and your regional goals. So that's something that's really important in some of those state and federal applications. And then it also informs the state and regional partners about your project. I know in our case, and I'm positive in BCRC's cases, oftentimes there are projects that we don't even know are happening until they submit them to the CEDS. And then once we see that, you know, we're sort of these organizations that if we don't have the funding or the capacity or the resources, we know who does. And so we definitely like to play the role of sort of liaison or connector, so we can see, oh, okay, Lake Perron is doing this project. You know, we hadn't heard of it before. Like, who do we know that has money to spend on those types of things, or that has done this type of project before and could provide advice, et cetera. So really, you know, getting people and organizations and towns to submit to this process is really about just signaling, hey, we're doing this cool thing. This is how it benefits our region's economy. Help us, help connect us to those resources, those funds. And this link here at the bottom of the page is a blog post we did a couple years ago, but it talks about CEDS projects that were submitted probably, I think, to the first CEDS, which was just for the Windham region, the 2014 Windham CEDS. But it talks about what the projects were when they submitted and then how they're doing now. And it really sort of shows that line of trajectory and growth, because I wouldn't say like 100%, it was all because they submitted to the CEDS, but because they did, our organizations were able to help out and provide those sort of resources and connections. So I will put that into the chat a little bit later so you can access that.
Okay, so one of the big question that we've sort of fielded here and there a little bit has been like, well, the timeline has shifted, as Sarah alluded to or mentioned earlier on, that we typically are looking at the first few months after the new year, and now we're looking at the last months of a current year for a submission. And there was Sarah used the term alignment earlier, and that's really what this shift is about. That we see the calendar year timing has become something that a lot of external interest in projects in our region, both as avenues for funding and more, have begun looking at that end of year for some of for what they're looking for. So the Northern Border Regional Commission, a federal funding initiative that a number of projects have sort of expressed an interest in over the years, is looking at, you know, there's a lot of state interaction around that, and that one is looking at a sort of year end for project submissions. We see the municipal projects from ARPA are more or less on a similar time scale as, you know, municipalities have to prep for town meeting day in the beginning of the year. The USDA project pipeline, ACCD project reporting. So both at state and federal levels, we see a lot of emerging interest in looking at calendar year for project submission. And that just illustrates how we felt like the CEDS, having a project submission component to a CEDS is not a requirement of a CEDS. Most CEDS, the vast majority of them, don't do this. Our region really wanted to have a process that prevented that sort of old story of the great plan that sits on a shelf. And this was a process by which we could demonstrate to the Economic Development Administration at the USEDA, from there at the Department of Commerce, what we're doing, how this process is related to the organizations in our region. And there's a little bit of sort of validation that goes on back and forth between the projects and the CEDS itself. So making this an important part of our process, you know, we sort of begin to notice that similarly, other elements are looking for projects. They want to know what's going on in a region. And by aligning with a calendar year end, we are all in a much better position to show that. So it really was sort of making the best use of our time and capacity. And that also gives us a little bit of a better alignment for resource referrals, as Sarah had referred to beforehand, that we see quarterly timetables for a lot of external funding. So being able to help an organization sort of position itself for a March, Q1 end, where there might be some deadlines for submitting a project, is a lot more valuable, we think, than being able then in February, being able to help an organization with that same March deadline. So a little more runway, knowing that we're all spread really thin, knowing that time is of the essence, and that in some instances, organizations need to go through a number of steps before they're eligible to apply for some external funding. Perhaps it's securing a CAGE code, registering with sam.gov. These are processes that can take time. Getting bylaws squared away, having officers elected, some of those things are sometimes requirements of these applications, of that external funding component. And the more time we have to do that work, to have that necessary blocking and tackling taken care of, the better the outcomes. And so we felt that by moving it up a little bit, we're in a much better position for all of us for what comes next. And Sarah, I think our next slide then addresses this a little bit.
I think before we jump into the actual nuts and bolts, I just want to pause and see if anyone has specific questions about sort of the process and how we got to this place before we jump into how you're actually filling out the form. And feel free to just unmute yourself. And okay, looks like we explained it really well, Jonathan. Good job.
Yeah, you don't want to break the spell. But this is the part that I think perhaps is really the meat and potatoes of this particular Knowledge Bites of how to submit a project. And first and foremost, we see that there is that prioritization and ranking that leads to vital project designation. And it's based on how each project advances CEDS objectives. And then additionally, readiness to begin, partners, investments made. Now, thinking back to the vital projects from just last year, you saw projects large and small, some things that are so almost statewide in some respects with Food Connects, some things that were village centered around Lake Perrin. So it's not the biggest is the best kind of approach. There's a lot of belief in small scale projects as being just as essential as large scale projects, but we do have a bit of a ranking process, and there's a really clear way through the project forms that shows in which an organization can consider how its project aligns with the CEDS objectives itself. And we've sort of designed it so that there is that engagement between what's in the document and what your project aims to do. And I think, Sarah, if I could share my screen now, we'll go to the page right there that you see, the So Vermont Zone.
I also do want to note, because I don't think we said it in so many words, but any project that is submitted is included in the CEDS. So even if your project is submitted, it is not chosen by the ranking, the project review committee as a vital project. As long as you hit submit, your project is included. And that is generally what those federal and state grant applications ask. They don't ask if you're a vital project. They ask if you are aligned. So I just want to make that clear.
Good point. Thank you, Sarah. And so this is where you land at sovermontzone.com/CEDS. And this page is really meant to provide access to all the materials. So there's some frequently asked questions, such as the ones that maybe we'll be discussing in a little bit, or the ones we've tried to anticipate with some of the content this morning. The report itself, the matrix for people who really want to dive way into the nuts and bolts of the CEDS. But then a link here for if you're interested in submitting a project, what this entails. And so if you select that link, you're taken to another page. Similarly, the materials are laid out there. And so some important timeline, details that we'll get into later on, but then you see new project submissions and project update submissions. And so in clicking that link, it takes you to the form, which I have highlighted here. This is for new projects. And I just wanted to give people here the chance to sort of take a look and see just how this is laid out, what this requires. And so some of the details you might expect of who, what, when, that sort of element. But then we have where it really is sort of tailored to what we're doing. The geographic region that your project encompasses. So maybe it's a single town, maybe it's multiple towns, maybe it's region-wide or something, at some smaller scale in between. And then the notion of, okay, what kind of a project do we have? And rather than keep highlighting those various fields, you'll see that we sort of describe what a public and nonprofit sector project might be like, what a workforce development and education project might be like, what private sector projects might be like, and what other infrastructural projects could be like. Now, we know that projects frequently can feel like a little bit of both, or they're in more than one category, but this helps us sort of allocate where the project is taking place, and then that assists the project ranking committee with, and assists us in sort of distributing that information to them. Similarly, you'll see that there's a sort of project stage component where we're talking about, all right, what stage are you in? And there's four options there about exploratory, preliminary, implementation, and then like sort of operational maintenance. And this is meant to sort of just assist the review team with a sort of an understanding of who's on board. Are we sort of just, we have a great idea and we want to get this in the pipeline, or sometimes it's, we've been doing this for 5 or 6 or 7 years and we're tweaking it a little bit and we just want to submit with sort of that in mind. Now, I mentioned how we want to talk about how we're aligned with the CEDS, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but the thought is here, we have a couple of important checkboxes that Sarah's going to hone in on in a few minutes, so I won't take too much time explaining those. As you might expect, a little overview of the projects, where there's a budget, if it exists, is it underway? But so some of that identifying information, but this is really where this form is most detailed, and this is the part that can take the most time. That I mentioned how we had those 5 objectives, and for each of those objectives, the CEDS articulated a number of strategies to meet those objectives. So for increase our population, for example, there were 3 that we sort of addressed, that we articulated in the CEDS. That was about attracting and retaining young people, attracting and retaining workforce, attracting and retaining more diverse populations. So whatever your project may be, if it meets one or more of those goals or those strategies, or it meets that objective of increasing the population in another way, just take a couple of words to let us know how. And that's really, and so that's the case for all 5 of these objectives that we sort of articulated in that CEDS about improving our physical infrastructure. We knew that we needed to talk about broadband and cell, transportation, housing options, water, wastewater. We need to talk about vital downtown and village centers. And so we know that we didn't capture everything. So that's why we have that other component for all of these objectives. And the thought is, if what you're working on would address any of these, we check the box and explain how. And so you'll see that with all 5 of these objectives, that the strategies we identified are listed there. And for a lot of projects, a lot of initiatives and organizations, this is a not unhelpful way of thinking through all that a project is meant to accomplish. Some are very, very focused, and that's a good thing. Some are very, very broad. That's also a good thing, more holistic. And we're not saying that the more boxes you check, the better, but the thought is that you really want to, it's very difficult to conceive of a project that meets none of these objectives, that encompasses none of these strategies. So almost everyone that's going to submit a project will be checking boxes, because that's very much what projects are for. So this is really just how this process looks. And there's an opportunity at the end to attach some supporting documents. Perhaps you have a feasibility study, perhaps you have some sort of initial sketches, whatever it may be. That's also helpful. That information goes to the project review committee, so some individuals will be able to sort of look at both what we're saying will happen and then any supporting documentation that might enhance or more inform their opinion and evaluation. So having looked at that one, I'm going to try to get over to the next one. which is
Jonathan, before you move on, I just do want to note, and I think it notes in one of the earlier questions, but this process is a public process. So if there is documents or information that is confidential, or that you aren't I'm not saying we're like sharing this all over the world or all over the state. However, it is a public process. So if there are items that you want to keep confidential, please don't share that.
Yep. So there's an example of the caveat that Sarah included as a public document. Please do not provide any confidential information. And by public, I think, as Sarah sort of said, it means FOIA vulnerable or something like that. So we don't get a lot of those. We don't get any of those requests. But the thought is just we want to make sure that what we're asking for doesn't jeopardize any sensitive information. So we ask that people exercise discretion, as Sarah said. That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that back to us. For those of you who've submitted a project before, or perhaps are with an organization that had submitted a project before, but this is your first year with the organization, there is a project update form, and Sarah will talk a little bit more later on about which projects have been submitted already. And so it's a much briefer form. And as you can see, some of the same identifying information, categories for projects and stages, and sometimes projects have moved from stage 1 in year 1 to stage 2 or stage 3 by the time we get around to it a second time. And a project update that you can provide, and then any supporting documents that you'd want to include that might reflect better where things are today from previous years. So it's much briefer, but the idea there is that it's certainly much more, and it's meant to reflect the fact that a lot of that information, that original information, is still on hand. And that's something that we can provide to the review committee to provide a little bit of context to enhance what's being discussed in the project update. So
Rob, I think Rob has a question.
Yeah,
Rob.
Jonathan, I don't know if this is the appropriate point for this question, but I have a project in mind, but I would actually like support from BCRC to help launch the project. Is that appropriate in this process, being that you guys sort of administer this process too, or is BCRC allowed to be a partner on a project with another organization?
So that's a great question. The answer is we certainly are allowed to be a project. In fact, sometimes our organizations submit our own projects. And one of the reasons that we really value having the project ranking committee sort of be at arm's length from us is that way we feel more comfortable with our level of involvement, whether as a partner with other organizations or with our own initiatives. So we provide the information and we sort of host the Zoom, or we host the event for the review committee. But Sarah and I and other BCRC, BDCC people are not on the ranking committee, and we really go out of our way to not influence what that group feels is meets the CEDS objectives the best. So by all means, Rob, let's talk about that. We're happy to partner up.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think your help would be super helpful in getting. I have 2 that I'm interested in submitting, but one of them I want to talk to you about before I submit. So, okay, I'll shoot you an email. We'll find a time to meet about that.
Sounds good. And I know we'll try to hold some time for Q&A as well at the end if there's others that want to have a couple.
Yeah, I have a 1 o'clock meeting, so I wanted to get that in before, in case it runs over.
All right, sure. So with that, I'll stop sharing, Sarah, and we'll maybe slip back to the slideshow.
Great. Okay, only a few more slides, so hang in there with us. So I just want to touch on the project timeline, project submission timeline, again, in a little more detail. So like we noted, projects are due November 30th. The project review and ranking will take place probably after the holidays, so probably sometime in January, early February. And then those projects, the rankings, or the vital projects that are chosen, will be announced in spring of 2022. I know in the past we've had some submitters sort of ask, hey, when are we going to find out like if we're a vital project or not?
If there is a grant deadline in which you want to include that information, if you are in fact a vital project, please just reach out to us. We'll share that information and ask you to not share it other than that application to another funding source until it's announced or to the public. But if there is a timeline you're trying to fit into and you want to include that you're a vital project, if in fact you have been chosen, then please reach out to us about that. So spring 2022, we typically announce it at the Southern Vermont Economy Summit, which happens in May. We might announce it again. We might continue that, or it'll be around that point in time. I do just want to note some of the questions to look out for, because I've already had questions from submitters about this. There is a question about ARPA funding. So this is obviously a new question since ARPA funding was not a thing last year. And this is essentially information gathering question for us. So typically it will be a municipal project that will be using the ARPA funds. And so we just ask, not necessarily that you are using ARPA funds, but that maybe is the intention to use some ARPA funds. I had a question from DV Fiber the other day about this question, which kind of prompted me to add it to the slide. They were asking, they're not using municipal ARPA funds, but they do have state ARPA funds. Should they check the box? And I told them, yes, please check the box. It's merely just for us to get a good understanding of what projects might be utilizing the ARPA funding. And then there is this sort of shovel-ready question, which I think was mentioned when Jonathan was talking about what project the project review committee looks at. And essentially this question is really to avoid people submitting projects that we like to call here somebody oughta. There are plenty of somebody oughta projects out there, but we want to know that, the project that you are submitting is something that you or your organization is working on, and that, it's sort of in this phase of like, you've kind of gone through the brainstorming of the project and you kind of have a framework already for it to either begin soon or it's already underway. So if you're a little confused about that question, that's just a little bit of sort of inside knowledge on why we had that question. And then last, I just want to make it as clear as possible. Jonathan mentioned this briefly when he was showing us the forms, but one of the questions I get the most is, should I use a new project form or a project update? So I just want to be clear that for a new project submission, you are using that form if you either submitted to the 2014 Wyndham Region CEDS or you've never submitted a project before. So if you don't know what the Wyndham Region CEDS is, don't even worry. Don't even worry about it. If it's a new project that you haven't submitted before, please use the new project form. And you'll see on that form, it says, please check here if your project was previously submitted and included in the Wyndham Region CEDS. Again, that's just sort of a information collecting question for us to know, oh, this organization did submit 7 years ago, but has not submitted something since. So it's just something for us to know. And then I just put a little disclaimer in there. If you had submitted, a year ago or 2 years ago, then you really should be using the update form. Here's a link for that. And then for the project update, you'll use this if you have submitted your project in 2019, 2020, or 2021. And that is within the bounds of the new CEDS, the 2019 Southern Vermont CEDS. And then there is this little, again, check it, if you have submitted, because you really shouldn't be using this form if you haven't submitted in the past 3 years. And then lastly, another big frequent question I get is, how do I remember if I've submitted? We understand everyone's super busy and generally, either they know they submitted, but they can't find the actual submission. So here's just a little advice. So you can find a list of all 2019, 2020, and 2021 projects. It is at the very bottom of that page that's linked there. And then often people are like, I know I submitted. How do I find what I submitted? So my suggestion is just to shoot me an email, and what I'll be doing is just sharing our Excel sheet that we have of all the projects and every question that's submitted. And I'll just share that with you, and you can find your project in there, see what you wrote for this question or that question, and hopefully that'll be enough to provide a project update. And that's it. I know it's kind of a lot all at once. I will send out this slideshow so you can have the links and sort of the reminders of some of that advice, but happy to answer any questions or thoughts, concerns. Yeah, Rob.
Do you ever see like duplicate projects in there and like connect those people and be like, you're both doing the same exact thing? I mean, does that ever happen?
Yeah, definitely. I think that sort of goes back to the piece, like, what's the point of submitting? We all have limited capacity. And so to know that there are these two groups doing the same or similar things is kind of a win for us, because we're like, ooh, like let's connect them. Either they can combine forces, or they can maybe each carve out, a specialty within that project. So yeah, that's, and it's not only a list for us, it's not only a list for state and federal agencies, it's a list for community members to see what's going on, look at all these really awesome projects that are happening in Southern Vermont, and maybe connecting, if we don't do it, which we will, but if we miss something, and you see a project on there that, either you were considering starting in your community or something like that, it's a resource for everyone here. So.
Thanks.
Yeah. Sarah, Martha, Steve, any questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
To clarify. So if we did submit something in the past in 2019, 20, or 21, but this would be kind of a new idea, different project, is it considered a new project, or are we still using the update form?
Good question. Yeah, I would use a new project form. Really, the updates is to update us and all the other agencies and the review committee what updates have happened on the project you already submitted. But if it's a new project, yeah, by all means, please submit a new project form.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Martha, Steve, anything?
I think so. You were very comprehensive. Thank you so much. This is
good.
very helpful.
I'm so glad we recorded that.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
I'll let Adam and Bill know.
Oh, thanks, Martha. Yeah, put in a good word.
Yeah.
Steve, what was that?
I just want to thank you all. I'm sitting in, I'm at MEDC right now, and we're working with Southwest Regional Planning Commission on updating our CEDS. So this has been really helpful to know how you're working, the process leading up to vital projects. So thank you.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear. And if you have any questions on the actual, updating or creation of the CEDS, we would be happy to talk. We could talk for hours, I'm sure, about the process we went through.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more quick question.
Yeah.
The kind of application form that you can get to online, is that in a PDF form anywhere to look at, or just?
It is not. Are you looking for just sort of having it so you can compile everything and then?
Right, before, I mean, obviously I saw that you could save and continue, but just to have it on hand.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good point. In the past, I think didn't have sort of the save and like come back later option, and that really like screwed some people up. So we did add that option. But, you know, Jonathan and I will talk after this, and I think it's fairly easy to put something like that together. So I do, you know, suggest that, especially when can't tell you how many online forums I've started to fill out and it times out or whatever, it gets lost, and then I just have to do it all again because it doesn't save, and that's really frustrating. So yeah, we'll definitely talk.
That would
about
be
that.
great. That would be great, because usually what I do is I just put it all in a Word doc and then I just copy and paste and fill in.
Yes.
Exactly.
Because exactly what you say, you get
Right.
timed out or something,
Right.
my connection blips.
Good practice. It is really good practice. And you should also, something we have changed over the past couple of years is when you submit, you should get an email that has your submission in it. So please, you know, for our sake, please save that. And if you can't find it, you know, the next time we'll gladly share, but it definitely does cut down on the requests for copies of submissions from us. So, you know, if you do have sort of a special place to put those kind of things, it would be great. All right. Well, now that we exhaustively covered how to submit a CEDS project, again,
I think the term is comprehensively, right?
Oh, comprehensive. Exactly. Thank you guys so much for coming. This process is really, really important to us. And like Jonathan said, it's not required. This process is not required by the EDA, but we feel it is incredibly important to know what's going on, hear from other people, not just be, you know, an echo chamber within our own organizations about the projects we're doing, because truly what benefits and makes, you know, this region economy hum, I believe was the word Jonathan used earlier, is truly those local and regional projects that are not done by us. You know, we couldn't do this without you all. So thank you again. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We love talking about this stuff. So be in touch, and we'll keep an eye out for your projects.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.